Now, those most at risk of dying from exposure to high heat include infants, the elderly, people with disabilities and users of some chronic medications. That's according to research by the South African Medical Research Council. The study looked at how excessive heat exposure has negatively impacted morbidity and mortality in the most vulnerable communities in Africa. To discuss this further, we're joined by a chief specialist scientist at the council, Dr. Caradee Wright, who joins us virtually from Pretoria. Dr. Wright, thank you so much for your time this evening. You made the point that the majority of these kinds of studies that we've seen done by experts such as yourself on the relationship between extreme heat exposure and morbidity and mortality have in the past been carried out in high-income countries, in developed countries, and therefore this research you cannot put an emphasis on how important that is. Talk to us about the basic sets of circumstances that make how heat is experienced in South Africa, for instance, or the continent as a whole, so different to perhaps countries in high-income countries in Europe.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me today and for the opportunity to share this with all of your listeners. It's really important for us to understand that heat in South Africa and on the African continent poses a risk for people who are living in housing which is not necessarily well equipped or thermally insulated to protect us from outdoor heat. So that's probably our first concern, is the homes that we're living in that are not well constructed to protect us from heat. This is especially a concern in backyard dwellings and shacks. Those materials allow the heat inside, and that's when our body can't cope with the excess temperature. The other big concern we have is that we have a lot of people working in outdoor occupations. So outdoor jobs, strenuous work, not necessarily wearing appropriate clothing that can breathe and allow your body to stay cool.
And the list goes on. I think that was brought into sharp focus just this past week, where we heard the news of the farm workers in the Northern Cape that sadly had lost their lives, allegedly as a result of exposure to heat. And it brought home a cocktail of events. We're dealing with an agricultural community under high pressure because of load shedding and its harvest season on top of that. And of course, because of climate change, we're seeing temperatures quite regular that we used to see only now and again. Do you think that industries like agriculture or industries in South Africa where people are working outside or living in certain circumstances are paying enough attention to the health of their workers as a result of heat specifically?
That is such a good question. And yes, we do have many employers in the country who are becoming more aware of this heat problem for their workers. A case in point would be the Working for Water program in the Western Cape. These people go and clear out alien plants from waterways, and they've shifted their entire day, their work day, to start very early in the morning rather than working in the late afternoon, which is the hottest time of the day. Other countries have done this well. For example, in Japan and Australia, road construction and road repair happens at night. So I do think we've started to see it, but I think there's more that we can do.
You also make the point about the advice that are given to people just generally to not be in this or outside in the middle of the day. I think personally today, for instance, I've got a toddler. So nap time is in the middle of the day, which is perfect. She can have a nap under a fan, which is a very privileged experience compared to the majority of the conditions that so many South Africans are living under. But you do make the very important point that it cannot just be left up to individuals to ensure that they are kept safe from the heat and that they follow certain practices to stay cool. You talk about businesses taking responsibility. Government's role is also very important here, especially when we're speaking about the provision of housing, like you've mentioned earlier. I mean, I remember you do the road trip through Northern Cape, and even in the Northern Cape, where we know temperatures are sky high at certain times of summer, but even there, people are living in shacks, and that's just not right, is it?
No, you've raised a very important point again. So we have to reconsider the reconstruction and development typical housing that's being provided. Not just the material used for the housing, but the spacing of the housing and the layout of windows and doors to ensure ventilation. All of these things are critical. You mentioned your toddler sleeping in the day, and that's really good to avoid the excess heat. But there's also ways you can cool somebody, for example, by wiping them down with a cool cloth. We're especially worried about infants, children, and the elderly who rely on others often to care for them. And then other really important things that somebody can do to try and keep cool is drink water, avoid fizzy drinks and alcohol or cold drinks. Put your hands and your feet in a basin of cool water if that's possible. I know water is difficult at the moment with the load shedding. And then try and open windows and doors of your house early in the morning, but close them before the worst heat of the day.
Do you think we take for granted that, hey, we live in Africa, of course it's going to be hot, 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 but we are seeing in our lifetime temperatures that we wouldn't have seen 10 years ago. It's only going to get, the conditions are only going to get hotter, isn't it?
Unfortunately, yes, that's the case with global warming. South Africa is projected to see, on average, temperatures becoming 4 to 6 degrees warmer by the end of this century, by 2100, which is a very big jump from the sort of 34 to 38s all the time, 38 degrees Celsius. So we really do need to think actively, both at personal level, but also encouraging our governments. They do have plans and guidelines like the National Climate Change and Health Adaptation Guideline, but we have to work hard with them to ensure it's implemented on the ground.
And we also have a great weather systems and forewarning scientists who are in place who, you know, before we used to always listen to temperatures on the radio or watch the temperatures on television. Now there's social media, and whether you're an individual trying to decide if you're going to the beach tomorrow, but more importantly, the agriculture sector, they know everything that they do is impacted by the weather. Your advice, I'm sure, would be that must be paid attention to even more now when farmers are preparing to send workers out there and knowing that they need to be prepared for what might come their way by 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock during that day of harvest.
Definitely. It's so important that we work more collectively as a whole. So this starts obviously with the government departments, whether it's agriculture, environment, health, labor, to really consolidate their efforts to make sure that they're thinking about climate change, especially global warming and the consequences of heat exposure for South Africans. So we start there, but at the end of the day, it comes down to an individual. And so we really would like to advocate for champions who can support through whether it's the labor unions or through activist groups to try and encourage people to take a voice to reduce this heat risk for our South African population.
And for workers to know what their rights are, and access to water on days like that is the most important. Wearing clothes that's appropriate as well, like you've mentioned earlier. Thank you so much for that. That's Dr. Caradee Wright from the South African Medical Research Council. Great research there looking at the impact of the high heats that we are experiencing and will continue to experience going forward. Still to